Okay, if you can open up another file for me. Hello. So this file is in session 10. And if you take a look in your session 10 folder, there's a file in there. It's just called 940 copy. If you can double click and open that guy up, that would be great. And again, this is not something you're going to see on the video. You'll hear it, but you need to take a look at it right now. I need everyone to come over here really quickly. Everybody over here, stand up, come on, walk over. You got to see this in person. Does anybody have a piece of white, just white paper? It doesn't have to be big, just something.
Could it be the back side of a paper?
Oh, yeah.
No? Wrong one.
Yeah, and I'll give it right back.
Oh, okay. Are you going to draw?
Oh, thank you. Got it. Okay, I need everybody to look at this really quick. So this is going to be my person. This is my light. Oh, come on. And if we take a look at this and we take a look at what happens with a shadow, you can see that the shadow starts much darker and tighter at its inception point, so really at the base. If you think of that as somebody's feet, it's sharper and tighter there, but then as it actually goes away, it softens, it spreads out, and it fades away, right? But it basically goes in just one direction. And that's not that hard. You guys have already been making those shadows. The gradient tool works really well to actually emulate that as long as you take your time and actually do a big number of them. However, we run into situations where that changes, compound shadows, and this is what happens on that. So in this case, you can see things change dramatically. They actually go back along in one direction, and then they completely change directions and go up the side of the back. Can you sort of see where they're going up that back part right there? That's what we need to create. That is a compound shadow. So that's what we're going to do right now. And this was just out of there somewhere. They can do it. So even though you didn't see it on the video, you're going to certainly see how to build it, and so you'll know what it is. By the way, that trick of doing that is something that you guys should keep in the back of your mind. If you're not entirely certain how a shadow might react to something, like how do shadows react on water, right? Take out a bowl, fill it up with some water, grab a pen and a flashlight, set it up on your coffee table, and you will see how shadows react with water. All of those kinds of things, if you can get ahead of it, on top of it, whatever, it'll just make your work a whole lot better. Okay, so to take a look at what this is really quickly, there's just a gradient on this. I'm going to come down to the very bottom. It's just the very bottom layer is the only thing that's actually been selected here. This is actually a real picture of the sky. If you double click on it, it's a smart object. I've actually changed the coloration of it a little bit. There was a woman who shot pictures, still does for Vogue all the time, and I just love the color of her skies. So I went out and I photographed a real blue sky, but then I shifted the color in it. So this has actually had color shifted in it, but that's all it is. But the advantage of actually shifting, advantage of actually shooting a blue sky as opposed to creating a synthetic one in Photoshop is, again, this thing has a grain to it. It has the discrete pixels that are actually happening in the sensor. Whereas if I created this thing in Photoshop, it would simply be one solid color, and you lose the sort of realism of it, certainly if you blow this thing up and you can see it big enough. If you go to the next layer up and simply turn it on, it's a gradient, and all I was trying to do was recreate what happens with a sky around noontime or when the sky is high. You actually have the sky as you get up higher in the sky is darker as you move towards the horizon line. It's lighter. That's the only thing this was about, was to do that. If you click on the next one up, what you can see is that this is actually now this. You don't see any of that sky now. The mask that we turn on in a second is going to add it. But this was actually taken on the roof of my old house, and what this is literally a thing of foam core that is no bigger than this binder right here. So I built a model out of foam core. What I had going on in my mind were all those pictures that they take in New Mexico. You've seen like the Bruce Weber pictures for all the Calvin Klein stuff. There's a lot of Georgia O'Keeffe famous stuff. People have gone to, it's that classic white stucco kind of like look vibe. That's what I wanted to sort of recreate in this. So I simply made it out of foam core. I took it on top of my roof and I shot it using available light. This is actually being lit by the sun. So you can see there's a shadow on the right-hand side that's real. You can see potted plants of mine that are sitting in the background that can give you some sense of scale. So anyway, that was the construction of my set. Now I masked it out. You'll see that there's an X over the layer mask on this, which is allowing you to see the plants. If you hold down the Shift key and click on that X, it gets rid of it, and now we've actually got the sky that I originally started with that's in my scene. So this is the way that I sort of wanted things to go. There's one last layer that we need to add to that visibility, so go ahead and click on that. And all of that did, if you zoom in really tight on the edge of the diagonal, if you turn that on and off, you can see that you can actually see the edge of the foam core cut. I wanted to get rid of that because I thought that that was a giveaway about what it really was. So this is basically the set that I'm going to actually work with. I'm going to double click on this, and then finally the body is in its own group. If you click on the very top, you'll actually show the figure. So this is what I wanted to composite into this scene, and this is what I need to create a compound shadow for. So in looking at this, the first thing that we've got to talk about is the direction of the light. So I'm going to turn the body off. Where's the light coming from in this image? Say what? It has to be coming from the right. There's nothing that would explain the shadow that's on that lower part of the wall. That's sort of like parawall, whatever that is. There, if the sun was coming from the left, there would actually be some object sitting in our scene that we would be able to see that would be casting that shadow, and there's nothing there. So it has got to be coming from the right side. When I click on the body, where's the light coming from the body? It's tricky. What most people do when they look for shadows, a direction of shadows, is they look at faces. It's the worst thing in the world you can look at. Look at her arm. Look at her leg. You'll know right away. The light here is now coming from the left side to the right. Look at the shadow on the side of her leg. There is no shadow on the left side. It's a big-ass one on the right side. There's no question about where that light's coming from, right? It's coming from over here. So I've now got cross lighting. I've got a mismatch. My background, the light is coming from the right side to the left. It's the exact opposite on the figure. So I need to either flip the background or I need to flip the girl. So the girl doesn't have anything on. There's no label, tag, written stuff. There's none of that stuff on there that I need to worry about, so I can just flip it. In fashion, just for those of you who are in fashion, a lot of times you do have to flip figures, and then if they have writing on them, you've got to cut the writing out and flip it back. And it becomes it's a great trick if you can pull it off, but it's not an easy thing to do. But just something to keep in mind. But this way we can simply flip the girl. So I'm going to select the body layer to make the group active, come up to the edit menu, down to free transform, down to flip horizontal, and she will go in the other direction. Now my lighting sources are actually matching, and you can see it's already better off. It's not completely believable, but we're certainly moving in a better direction. Everybody good on this part so far? Okay, so now I actually need to create the light, and you can tell by the shadow that already exists there. It is a relatively hard light. This is not the sort of thing that we are going to create using gradients. We actually need to steal from this figure to build our shadows. We're going to take it from, we're going to use her to actually build the shadows here to do it. So to start off with, I'm going to select the top layer of my background. So again, all of those things. Let's go ahead and put the whole background in a group. It'll just make life easier for us. So I'm going to select the layer right underneath the body. I'm going to go all the way down, hold down my Shift key, and select the one that's on the very bottom. Come over to the menu on the side, on the right-hand side from the tab that says Layers. Click on the drop-down, and I'm going to say New Group from Layers. And I'm going to call it Set. And say OK. It'll just make things a little bit easier and cleaner for us. With Set active, if you click on the Add Layer, the plus at the very bottom of the Layers palette, it'll add a blank layer to it. I'm going to then double-click on it and call this Shadow 1. And say OK to that. Now, I need to load the girl as a selection. I need to get her outline going because that's what I'm going to base my shadow on. So I'm going to open up the body so that I can get to the girl in there. And when I see things like this gets me very nervous in here because I've got a puppet warp of the body, but I've also got a retouch layer. I've got an airbrush layer. I've got some color action that's actually happening on here. I've got a number of things that are happening in there. That makes me very nervous. So I need the totality of all of them. So I'm going to collapse the body again. I'm going to turn off the shadow layer and I'm going to turn off the background set. I'm going to select the body group. So again, I've turned everything off. Everything in the body group is on. It's now this figure just on a blank outline. I'm going to hold down the Command, Option, Shift, and the letter E, and it will make a merge stamp version of everything that was in that group into a final image. This will give me my final outline of the figure. And then I'm simply going to Command click on that to load it as a selection. At this stage of the game, I'm also going to, just because I'm here, save this as her body. So up to the Select menu, down to Save Selection, and we'll just call it Body. Body Final. And say OK. You can now throw that thing away. You don't need it. We need to turn on our Shadow 1 layer again and make it active. You can also turn on the eyeball of the set. So now I've got an active selection going of her body, and I'm on my Shadow number 1 layer that's blank right now. Is everybody good with this? Okay, my foreground and background colors are not at their defaults. I've still got that light gray on the foreground color. So I'm going to hit the D key to get my foreground colors to be black and white. It actually makes black my foreground color. I've got an active selection going. I've got Shadow number 1 selected. So Option Delete simply fills the selection that I had in Shadow 1. If you turn off body, you can see it's just a black selection right here. I'm going to hit Command D to deselect. So basically, I've just created a silhouette of this girl's body. I'm going to duplicate that. Command J to make a second copy, and I'm going to rename this Shadow 2, and we are good to go. So I'm going to turn body back on. I'm going to work with Shadow number 2 first. I'm going to leave Shadow number 1 right where it is. I don't need to actually move this guy. If you looked at the illustration that I did when we had the pen against the wall, what you should have remembered or seen from that is that the shadow that hits that back wall is perfectly up and upright, just like the figure is. If there was any tilt in the pen, that tilt would have been reflected in the background. There is a diagonal on the shadow that leaves her feet and goes to that back wall, but the shadow on the back wall is exactly up and down like the girl is. It's just lower. Make sense? So I'm going to actually mask this out so that I can see this happen in real time. I've made some masks for you already. If you come over and you look at the channels down towards the bottom, you will see that there's one that's called back wall, And if you take a look, you can see the only thing that's visible is that diagonal piece of wall in the back. The floor and the sky and the rest of the scene, that back wall, are all masked out. So this is the one I'm going to use. I'm going to command click on that thumbnail to load it as a selection. I'm going to come over to my Shadow 2 and simply add it as a layer mask. And when I do that, it's actually going to hide probably the majority, if not all, of that black image. That part doesn't matter. Now, the mask is in the correct spot, but the shadow isn't. Yes?
Can you go back a sec?
Sure.
Did you just...
All I did was load the back wall as a selection, command click.
Okay.
Come over to your Shadow 2 and add it as a layer mask.
All right, I'm with you.
Okay. I need to keep the mask where it is. I don't want to move the mask, but I need to move the shadow. So to do that, you need to break the link between the mask and the pixel layer by clicking on it. Now we can actually click on the pixel content that is the shadow, hit the V key to move it, and simply click and drag. And you can see the mask is not moving, so I can place this person over here on my background to emulate the direction of the light. And that's what I'm looking at right now. I'm trying to get a feel for this light as it's coming across and throwing the shadow on the background. Where would it be? Would her shins be showing? Would we be losing top of her head? Would it be down further? Would it just be her knees are actually coming in there? Would it be down even further still, more like this? Where is it actually going to, is it over here on the wall further? Is it in here? You have got to look at your image holistically, for lack of a better way of putting it, and just say, okay, does this make sense to me? When I look at this, I think it still needs to be down a little bit more and probably in just a little bit more. Again, I'm trying to get that sense of this light coming down here. I'm looking at the shadow on her face. I'm looking at all of those parts, and this seems to feel right to me. You may have a different spot for it, but nonetheless. The thing about this is, though, that this shadow doesn't really get changed, distorted, twisted a whole lot. This shadow actually remains pretty much like it is right now. Jack? Because do you have this layer mask that's on your shadow layer? Yeah. Did you break the link between the two? Yeah. Did you click on just the pixel layer and move it? Oh, yeah, I really moved shadow 1. Yeah, well, that'll happen as well. It's okay. So has everybody got something sort of like this going? Anybody not? Okay, next move, shadow number 1. So what we now need to do is build the shadow between her and the shadow that's on the back wall. So to do that, it's going to be a transform. So I'm back on shadow number 1 right now, Command T to bring up the transform dialog box. Now, if I have my cursor outside of the transform dialog box, we've got that double-headed arrow thing that allows you to rotate the shadow, which is what we're going to do. The issue, though, is that I don't want the shadow to move from her feet. So instead of doing the shadow anchored right around her crotch, which is where the anchor point is, I'm going to grab the anchor point and bring it down right between her toes at the bottom. At this stage of the game, now when I do my rotate, the feet stay fixed. I mean, you could do it the other way, but eventually it just takes so much. It's like it ends up being a nightmare to actually get to this. However, what I'm going to try to do is get this down here to actually line up with the figure that's actually on the background wall. That's going to be my goal in all of this. The problem that I have with this, though, is it's actually falling on the background wall as well, and I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to hit the little circle up at the top that's got the line slashing through it, which will undo the transform. It's now gone right back the way it was. Before I do this transform, I need to add its shadow, its mask as well. So I'm going to load the back wall again. So I'm simply hovering over that in the channels palette, hold down the command key and click to actually load it as a selection. I'm going to then add this as a layer mask to my shadow 1. But then if I use this the way it is right now, it's only showing that back wall. I want that back wall hidden. So you invert this, Command I. Now when we actually move it, you'll actually only see the shadow as it's hitting the floor. Also at this stage of the game, because you can get into doing really extreme transforms with when you're doing this kind of work, you're better off doing this on the paste board. So I'm going to hit the F key once to get to the paste board, because that way I can get my control handles way beyond this edge of the image, which is going to ultimately help me out. Again, I'm going to break the link between the mask and the figure. The mask, I do not want it to move. It's exactly where it should be. But the figure, the shadow one, I want that to be able to move. So I'm going to click on the chain link between the two and then select the pixel layer so that I can then move that move that shadow and transform it to try to get it to hook up with the part that's going on the back wall. Yes?
So I'm following, but for some reason, like, the fact that the wall is black, which is hidden, and I don't understand how this is happening. I get it as a process,
Right.
But like the second shadow, how is that allowing it to go behind the wall if they're both black? Does that make sense?
Well, did you invert this? Look, these are the opposite of each other.
Yeah, but aren't we sliding the shadow onto the wall?
What I need is the shadow that leaves her feet and runs along the floor and hits this back shadow on the back wall. That's what I'm trying to make right now.
Okay, I think I get you.
Let's get into it a little bit and see if it doesn't make a little bit more sense.
Okay.
Okay. So I've broken the link between the mask and the pixel layer. I've got the pixel layer selected. You can see you've got the brackets around it. Command T to do a transform. Grab the anchor point and drop it all the way down right between her feet, and then do a rotation and pull this whole thing down, and you will see that her legs start to get revealed down on the bottom. Right? However, they're nowhere near what they need to be to actually match up with the part that's down at the bottom. That's a shadow that's coming off the side of the girl. It would be much, much, much skinnier. It would be much, much, much more distorted, which is what we're going to do right now. The first thing I'm going to do is make it skinnier. So I'm going to grab the control handle that is in the sort of what would be the middle of the transform dialog box, and I'm going to click on it and just drag it down so that I start getting it a little bit narrower. It also would be spread more out. It wouldn't just be like laying flat. So I'm going to grab the handle now all the way to the left-hand side, and I'm going to drag it out a little bit more to actually elongate those legs. You'll see that it's actually anchor point is no longer where it's by her feet. So I'm going to click in the shadow and bring it back up so that it's coming down from the bottom of her feet. And it's pretty loose in this arrangement right here. So if you need a finer degree of motion, you can simply use your arrow keys to tap it in. I'm going to have to come in and look at her feet a little bit more. I'm actually going to zoom in on this whole image a little bit here. So again, I want the shadow coming off of her feet. So at this stage of the game, you can see I've got one leg that's sort of beginning to get there, another leg that's nowhere close to that. So I am going to continue to compress this. So I'm grabbing the control handle that's on the sort of the top middle part, and I'm going to make it narrower still. And you can see I'm beginning to get these to come out to sort of somewhat line up with the legs. I'm going to pull this other one out just a little bit more. You're never going to get this part perfect. We can actually go in there and tweak it. But if I zoom in on my image right now, you can see that I've got one that's actually lined up on one edge here pretty good. I've got another one that's not quite lined up. We're going to have to fix that one in just a second. In my other image, I've also got pretty much the same situation that's going on in here. So at this stage of the game, I'm feeling pretty good about this part. We could try to fine-tune this a little bit more. I'm not sure that this is going to work, but we can try it. If you click the warp tool, that's actually the thing that's up at the very top in our options panel. For me, it's always looked like sort of some, I don't know, a graph that's been bent or something. If you can't remember the little icon up there, it's also in the transform group. You can come down to your transform group and click on warp. And when you click on warp, it puts in those guidelines. When we were doing our fabric, the digital diet part, we were using the warp tool here. You can actually grab the handles that are on this and you can actually use them to try to fine tune this stuff a little bit. I don't think I'm going to get a whole lot of action out of this. It's just going to be easier for me to go in and fix this part. So that's going to be the way I'm going to actually go about doing this. I'm not going to worry about this part right now. I'm simply going to say okay. I'm going to hit the check mark and say okay to that. Now if I zoom in, you can see that I actually have problems where these two meet, but everybody at least gets something that was going back and hitting part of the stuff that's in the background. Yeah, close enough, right? So to fix this part, I need to mask these things out. The problem is that I don't want to screw with this mask that's controlling the background wall right now. I don't want that. I don't want to mess with this. So you need to do what they call nested masking. And what that means is that I need to come up with a way to put another mask on this whole layer without affecting the one that's already on there. And the way you do that is by putting it in a group. So I'm going to add a group right above that shadow number 1. So I'm simply going to click on the thing that looks like a folder. I'm going to put my shadow number 1 into that group. And then I'm going to click on the group to make it active. I'm going to add a layer mask to the group. Now, the mask that's inside of the group is controlling us not being able to see it hit the wall, but now anything that I do on this group mask will allow me to modify what's going on her legs as well. So at that stage of the game, it's Pen Tool. Hit the P key to get the Pen Tool. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to click on the intersection where the first shadow on the floor is actually hitting her knee. I'm going to click on it and then I'm just going to pull out some sort of organic shape to sort of like, what I'm just trying to do is get rid of that, to have this whole thing taper off. So I'm simply going to come back around for my selection. So this is basically what my mask is going to, the mask is going to look like. So I'm going to go to my path palette. I'm going to command click to load that as a selection. I'm going to go back to my layers palette. We need to feather this selection just a little bit. It's not much. That shadow back there is not that soft, but I am going to feather it just a little bit. Up to the select menu, down to modify, down to feather, and I'm going to put a 1/2 pixel on it. This is stuff that we have been doing throughout this class. Every time we've done a composite after the 3rd or 4th week, we did exactly this stuff right here. So, working on the group mask right now, I need to hide this part. So that means I need to fill it with black on this group mask. Black is my foreground color. Option delete takes care of it. Command D to deselect. I've now got that lined up. You will notice that there's a little white line that separates these two. That is actually the width. When I made this thing, I actually used the pen tool to actually make the background masks. That's actually the width of the pen tool. We will fix that later as well. However, now I need to do the other side, and it's going to be the very same trick. The P key to get the pen tool. I'm going to click where the background intersects. And then I'm going to come down and again put some sort of curvy shape in here. I don't actually like putting in straight lines, although I don't like where I put that line either. So I'm going to bring it down here a little bit more to sort of where her knee part would be. I'm going to click and drag out just to put a little bit of curve in it. And then simply come back again. Go to my path palette. Command click to load that as a selection. Up to the select menu, down to modify, down to feather. 1/2 pixel is fine. Back on my layer, on my group mask, I'm going to fill this with black. Now you'll see there's a small mistake that happened right here in this area right here where my pen tool came in. There is nothing that's stopping me from going to my tablet, zooming into this area, grabbing the brush, a B key, making it a much smaller brush. Fairly hard brush. I'm going to go up into the sort of 70s, 80%, somewhere up in there. Normal, 100% flow, 100% opacity. Click on this. Black is my foreground color. And again, what I need to do is this area actually needs to show on my layer mask. So I'm painting with white, working on the layer mask, and just bringing that part back. I could have gone in with the pen tool again and done the same thing. Not going to do it. I'm going to zip back out. We need to fix the other leg. You'll notice on the other leg, though, the one side is too short and the other side is actually too long. So we can do the opposite of what we were doing here on this, working on the layer mask. I'm going to connect this using the pen tool again, the P key. I'm going to click on the edge of where the shadow starts on the back wall. And I just need to add that small little bit to the layer mask. Hang on one second. Let's not do the pen tool on that at all. I'm going to Command Z to get rid of that part, and Command Option Z to get rid of the pen tool. I'm going to go back to my brush, the B key. I'm going to scroll down onto my pixel layer, the layer that actually is the shadow that we're working on, and I'm going to simply hit this with a black. So black is my foreground color, and I'm simply going to tap that in. And that does not want to tap in because my group layer is actually hiding that part. I think it is anyway. I'm going to load that selection. Yeah, that's what actually clipped it. So that mistake that's happening in there is from the layer mask that I used to shape the other leg. So I'm going to go back up to the group number 1. White is my foreground color, working on the layer mask, and I'm going to reveal that area again. So that part's good, and then one final one, I need to connect the other side of that leg. So again, back to the pen tool, click where those two join, come back and drag some sort of shape out into here and bring this all around. Go to the path, Command click to load it, select menu, modify, feather, half a pixel, layers palette, working on my group mask. I need to hide this area. That means I need to, black is now my background color, so Command delete will actually get rid of that. Command D to deselect. Now in taking a look at these two, this actually seems pretty good to me as far as this part goes. It's set off though. You can see it's not where it actually should be. So I've got to transform the entire group now because it doesn't match up with her feet anymore. And I didn't realize that before I started doing all of this work on it. So hopefully I'm going to be able to transform the entire thing. So I've selected the entire group, Command T to bring up the transform dialog box. I'm going to anchor this right at one of her legs right here. I don't want that part to move. And then I'm going to rotate the feet so that it actually comes off of her feet more where that would actually be. That screws up some of my layer masking and all of this kind of stuff, so I'm going to have to redo those guys. I should have set the feet actually first, and I didn't. So that means I'm going to get rid of everything that's on the group mask. So, because I've got to do it again. It doesn't match up here at all. Well, actually, maybe that's not true. Yeah, I'm going to just get rid of this group mask. I'm going to delete it, and we'll start that whole process over. So on the group, add a layer mask, pen tool, click on that one leg, bring it down to sort of give me some sort of shape in there, come back around. I'm going to do this pretty quick. Path, Command click to load it as a selection, back on that, up to the select menu, down to modify, feather it a half a pixel. In the group mask itself, I need to hide this, so I'm filling it with black. Black is my background color, so Option delete, Command D to deselect. Do the same thing on the other leg. Path, Command click, select menu, modify, feather, half a pixel, back on the group mask, fill this with black, Command D to deselect. Pen tool. Path, command click, select menu, modify, feather, half a pixel, back to the layer mask, on the group layer mask itself, fill that with black. And last pen tool. Path, command click, select menu, modify, feather, half a pixel on the group itself, and fill that with black. So this is now where I'm at, and this is actually looking considerably better. I need to check her feet really quick, just to make sure that I've actually got something that's believable coming off the bottom of this. And I do. There's a little bit of shadow that's showing underneath her heel right here that I don't like, so I'm going to get rid of that. I can still do that on my group layer right here. I'm just going to hit the B key to get a brush, the X key to make black my foreground color, and working on this layer mask, I'm simply going to get rid of that little bit that's right in there. The stuff that's actually coming off of her other foot, I'm sort of happy with where this is. I'm okay with this part happening pretty much like it is. So I'm feeling pretty good about this layer mask. However, this is not a true shadow. So what a lot of people will do is this. They would actually, at this stage of the game, they would combine just the shadows into one whole shadow, and we need to do that. So I'm going to turn the eyeball for the body off. I'm going to scroll down and turn off the eyeball for the set off. And the only thing that I've got showing right now is my shadow. Again, I've got all of these, the 4 or 5 things that are actually making this. I've got all that's happening, but I need it all together into one space so that I can actually work with it. So to do that, select the very top shadow, and again, we're going to do that same keyboard trick, Command, Option, Shift, and the letter E to do a merge stamp version of what is visible. So Command, Option, Shift, and the letter E. It actually creates that, and then I'm going to turn off all the things that actually made the mask. That part's actually, I'm happy with where this thing is going for me right now. So I've got this part going on in here. However, we need to consider some of the other things that we talked about that happens with a shadow. So you remember, a shadow actually gets a little bit darker as it's closer to the body. So we need to actually do that with this shadow mask. I'm going to turn on the body again. I'm going to turn on the set again, but I'm going to leave off the things that built my shadow, and I'm just going to work with this the merge stamp version of it. I'm going to double click on it and call it Shadow Final. Then I'm going to add a layer mask onto this. And again, if I want this to fade, I can do it using a gradient, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hit the G key to get a gradient tool. I'm going to go up to the very top of my gradient, the options palette, to select the basics black to white or foreground to background gradient tool. The first of the icons, you want to select that. That's a linear gradient. And then working on this layer mask of that shadow layer, I can actually black as my foreground color, which means if I start this at her feet, it's going to hide her feet. If I start this, if I flip it, if I make X as my foreground color and start at her feet will show, and as I get to the background, it'll fade out. So I'm just going to show you what this looks like really quick. I'm going to click and drag back, and you can see it fades the whole thing. But it causes the background to disappear. This is far too extreme for me to actually do this. So a way to fix that is, I'm going to make my image even smaller so that I can really control this. I'm going to put I'm still doing the same gradient. Oh, every time you pull a gradient on anything, it writes over the old one. So the old one is wrong. We don't need to worry about it. We're just going to do a new one. But I'm going to click again at her feet with the gradient tool. Sorry. I'm going to click and drag, but I'm not going to stop at this edge. I'm going to bring this way beyond that edge. So now it's happening is it's going from white to black, but that black is all the way outside of my image. And now when I let go, you can see it just fades that background out just a little bit. That's the only thing that's actually happening here. So do I believe that? If you come in here and take a look at it, you can see that this background is a little bit lighter. The foreground where her feet are darker, and that's exactly what we saw when we were doing the whole trick over here, was that fade. Is this working for everyone? X key. So we also know, though, as it begins to leave, as the shadow leaves her body, it also gets softer. So we need to turn this shadow layer into a smart object. To do that, the layer is selected. Simply come up to the layer menu, down to Smart Objects, Convert to Smart Object. Now it's actually, inside that smart object is not only the shadow, but it's actually also the, it's also the fade, the gradient fade mask on there. That's sitting inside there. That part's fine. Now I'm going to blur this thing. I'm going to do the same trick, but I'm going to do it for blurring. So I'm going to come up to the filter menu, and I'm going to come down to blur, and I'm going to come down to Gaussian blur. And what you want to do is you want to actually look at the blur that's on the background. Now for me, this Gaussian blur doesn't really work that well. I think a better blur for doing shadows is actually a radial blur. So back up, so I just hit cancel, come back up to the filter menu, come down to blur, and we're going to come down to, I take it back, it's not radial blur, it's motion blur. And when motion blur comes out, you will see that there is an angle slider for motion blur. And that's the direction of the blur. If you take a look at this image right now, you can see that the edges, the sides of here, don't have a lot of blur on it. And that's because this thing is angled, this little wheel is angled for the blur to only move either up or down. You can change this so that it goes from like 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock instead. And now what you'll get is the edges to the side blur, the stuff on the very top of her shoulders does not blur so much. So this, for me, is a more believable blur. I like this better for shadows. The distance is controlling how strong that blur is, and I was at a 24. That's way too strong. It's just going to be a pretty sharp edge back there. If you take a look at the shadow edge that is existing, the real one, you can sort of get an idea of how dark this shadow should actually be. So that's what I'm going to do here. So I've got a distance of around 14. I've got an angle of 1. That's what I'm doing, and I'm going to go ahead and say OK to this. So this is the beginning part of our shadow, and what a lot of people at this stage of the game would do is they would actually simply drop the opacity of this to make it a lighter shadow. And you look at this and you say, yeah, well, okay, that's a little bit better. The problem with this is that we've got a real shadow in here, and the real shadow in here is not necessarily the same color as this. Not only that, actually dropping the opacity of black is not the same thing as changing the tone the way a shadow would really work. So I'm going to actually match the color of that shadow. I'm going to bring the opacity of this all the way back up. I'm going to command click to load this smart object as a selection. I'm going to then add a layer, just a regular curve on top of this. Now I've got a curve that's actually got that softness that's in here. It's also got the fall off that's in here. It's got the lighter shadow in the back, the darker one next to her body. All of that is built into this layer mask. I'm going to turn off the shadow. I don't need to see that part anymore. I am going to go to the eyedropper color sampler tool. We're going to do the same sort of work with the same tool that we did before, working with when we were doing our building our luminosity masks, and we were putting down points to try to get the background to go to black and the white foreground to go to white. It's the same thing we're doing here. I'm going to clear all my points here just so that we can start fresh and new on that. I'm going to put 1 point down. I take that back. I'm going to temporarily turn on this shadow final so I know where to put this point. And I'm going to put the point, this first point, like right in the middle of her waist. I'm then going to turn that off. I just need to see where the shadow was. And I'm going to do a second point pretty much right in the middle of the real shadow that's on the back wall, sort of in that middle part. So these are my points 1 and 2. I do have a curve on here. It's actually got the layer mask already built for it. If you take a look at the readouts that we have on this, I don't want this to actually be, yeah, that's actually good. Okay. The way a true shadow works is that it is a loss of highlight. So to do this, I need these numbers to match. My 241, 241, 240, my point number 1 is this point right here that has no shadow on it right now. My 157, 152, and 148, this is what I was talking about right here. This is not a neutral gray. There is actually less blue than there is red. So this shadow that's over here has got a slightly red-yellow cast to it. I need to match that for this to be believable. So I'm going to start right off the bat just using the luminosity channel, the the composite RGB channel. And I'm going to click 157 is the highest number of the shadow I'm trying to match. So I'm simply going to drag this down until I get everybody down to 157. Again, I'm watching my number 1 readouts right here. So these all now read 157. I'm then going to go to my green channel, and I need my green not to be 157, I need it to be 152. So I'm still dragging from the very top down till I get down to 152. And then I'm going to go to my blue channel. My blue channel is not 156, it should be 148. And I'm going to pull this down to 148. Boom. Did this work for you guys? Where did you get lost? So with the gradient to control the darkness from the shadow at her feet to the background? So the gradient for the shadow part, it's right here. This is it right here. It's just a small gradient so that things are darker at her feet and lighter in the back. So what? Let me see. Yeah, so that's the right idea. It's just too extreme. Your gradient is too strong. So again, you can still do it here. Make your image much, much smaller. Yep, that's fine. And then click on your gradient again. Same gradient tool. So we're going to click on X here because you need to start with white at her feet. And click right by her feet. And then drag way out. You can drag all the way up into here and let go. Boom.
Okay.
Don't feel like you need to stop at your gradients. You need to stop at the edges of this. You do not. So I'm telling you this right now, guys. You know that this is fake. I know that this is fake. But if you took this out, I don't care, go into the computer lab, go into that lab, whatever, and ask anybody what they think is weird about this image or that kind of stuff. Fake composite is not going to be it. Are we good on this part? All right. Now would be another great time for a 10-minute break. You can close this up. I'm doing the 7s today. I got 307, be back at 317, and we'll start working on other things.